The war ends not with a bang, but with a quiet, digital silence. On February 26, 1991, in a bunker deep beneath Moscow, a Soviet general reads a final dispatch and understands that the maps he spent a lifetime mastering no longer mean anything. The rules of war, the very physics of conflict he believed to be immutable, have been rewritten in a single, brutal, 100-hour lesson. It begins in darkness and silence, not the comforting silence of peace, but the dry, digital silence of a dead network. The bunker smelled of stale coffee and old cigarette smoke. Deep below the frozen Moscow streets, the building's ancient radiators clanged with a rhythmic, metallic sound, like the distant echo of spent artillery. In the corner of the room, a single, battered teletype machine clattered out a final, grim string of lines, and then went still. General Mikhail Moise, a man whose face was a map of hard-won certainties, read the last dispatch as if the flimsy paper itself might explain why his world had stopped making sense. The date was February 26, 1991. For the better part of 2 months, the world had watched a new kind of war unfold, a conflict conducted at a scale and tempo that seemed to defy the known limits of military science. It began on January 17th with an air campaign of almost surgical patience, followed on February 24th by a ground assault codenamed Desert Sabre. The war that the Soviet manuals had prepared for, the deliberate artillery duels, the brutal tank-on-tank slugfests, the slow, grinding arithmetic of attrition, had been declared over in 100 hours. An entire army, one of the largest in the world, had been dismantled in less than 5 days. Mikhail had spent his life learning the language of weight and distance, of mass and velocity. He understood war as a form of physics. A flank could be held because you could count the tanks, count the rounds, count the fuel convoys, and make the great ledger balance. He had been schooled to believe that warfare was an algebra of mass. Now, looking at the final, unbelievable reports from the Iraqi desert, he felt as though his ledger had been thrown into a furnace and burned to ash. The numbers were all wrong. The equation was broken. Across the room, a young colonel, his branch insignia glinting in the dim light, rubbed his knuckles hard against his face as if trying to wipe away the memory of a sound. In his head, he replayed the first battlefield intercepts they had received just days before. The voice on that tape, raw and broken, barked in terrified English through layers upon layers of static, had been a plea for orders that never came. The Iraqi commander, trained by Soviet advisors, had screamed into his radio, "Our tanks, they are on fire, they are not hit. The engines are just burning. Sir, the sky, there are lights." The voice had then dissolved into a scream, followed by a thin, high-pitched electronic shriek, and then a block of pure, sugar-white silence. The signals, analyst had played it 100 times, and still, the young colonel's hand went cold every time he imagined pressing pause. 5 feet from the main map table, Elena Markova sat with a stack of large, glossy photographs in her lap. She was a satellite imagery analyst, a woman who had spent 15 years of her life training her eyes to discern the meaningful from the mundane in the grey, abstract world of aerial reconnaissance. She could spot a hidden supply trail, calculate the exact angle of a trench, and find the ghost of a vehicle hidden under a tree. But the latest photos from the Gulf were the ones that refused to be mundane. She had been awake for 2 days, her eyes glued to the high-contrast images relayed from the new American J-Stars surveillance aircraft. She was looking at what had been a 6-lane artery the night before, a road that by morning had been transformed into a sprawling, iron pattern of death. 2,000 vehicles crushed and burned like insects, tank turrets blown clean off their hulls, trucks fused to the asphalt in pools of orange, melted glass. "They are calling it the highway of death," she said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. She slid a photograph across the table toward the general. But in the images, this is not chaos, it is purpose. Miguel looked down at the photograph. Purpose was what he craved. He wanted a thing he could point to, a new weapon he could reverse engineer, a single, brilliant tactic he could replicate. For him, the war wasn't truly over because soldiers had been killed. It was over because his models, his entire intellectual framework for understanding conflict, had been falsified. A doctrine that had dominated military parades and terrified parliaments for decades, a doctrine of layered air defense, of maskirovka and deep battle, had encountered something it could not measure, and it had shattered. In the first frantic nights of the ground war, the theories spun like brittle twigs in a flood. A secret, faster stealth bomber, a new kind of space weapon, electronic demons that could rewrite radar returns in real time. In the smoky back rooms of the Stavka, the high command, men of the old guard barked the obvious comforting answers. They blamed the Iraqis for their cowardice. They blamed the commanders for failing to properly follow Soviet deep battle doctrine, for abandoning their phase lines and dispersing their logistics. But the data, the intercepts, and the photographs were obstinate. Entire units, trained, supplied, and in some cases commanded by Soviet officers, had been plucked like ripe fruit out of the darkness. The truth, as it was slowly and painfully dawning on them, was less a single, discoverable secret, and more a terrifying new architecture. It was an enemy assembled not from one miracle weapon, but from a dozen small, almost ordinary things. They were the products of obscure American research projects seeded by DARPA since the 1970s. Each project, on its own, was just an incremental improvement. But when woven together into a single, seamless fabric, they had become a new kind of instrument, not a bigger gun or thicker armor, but a unified battlefield-wide nervous system, a system that could see everything, everywhere, all at once. In the cold, sterile environment of the Moscow bunker, the search for a tangible culprit intensifies. The Soviet mind, trained in a materialist doctrine, looks for a machine to blame, a piece of hardware that can be studied, copied, and countered. They are hunting for a single ghost, a superweapon that can explain the totality of their defeat. But the ghost is not a single entity. It is a system, a network of seeing eyes and thinking machines that has rendered the traditional battlefield obsolete. Elena Markova, the imagery analyst, hands General Moyes another J-STARS frame, a single radar sweep of the desert. To the untrained eye, it is a meaningless collection of icons on a screen. To Moyes, it is a revelation. The image, captured by a phased array radar housed in a massive canoe-shaped pod under a converted civilian airliner, has the reach of a nation and the resolution of a watchmaker. Every single moving vehicle on the battlefield below is marked as a clean little dot. On this single monitor, an operator flying safely at 40,000 feet can watch a T-72 battalion start its engines. He can see a supply convoy pull onto a road. He can watch as individual tanks coalesce into an attack formation. The J-STARS operator can isolate a single tank, tag it with a digital marker, and then, with the click of a button, hand that target off to another platform in the network. The information is no longer a static point on a map. It is a live, streaming packet of data. That, Eleanor says, her finger tracing the flow of information on a diagram, is a general, a flying general who sees the entire battlefield at once. But seeing is only the first step. The true power of the system lies in its ability to connect that sight to a weapon. High above the J-STARS, another aircraft, an E-3 AWACS, flies in a lazy orbit. The AWACS is the choreographer. It takes the live feed from J-STARS and deconflicts the airspace. It analyzes the angles, speeds, and available ordnance of every friendly aircraft in the sky. It decides, with the cold logic of a computer, which fighter or attack helicopter has the best and safest approach to a given target. On a digital slate that looks like a simplified video game, the AWACS controller can drag the icon for an Iraqi tank and assign it to an F-15E Strike Eagle. That F-15 pilot, who may be dozens of miles away, is no longer a hunter searching for prey. He is a delivery system. He simply receives a pre-verified digitally designated dot on his own screen. A single Iraqi tank, its heat signature confirmed, its location precise to within a few feet. He flies to the coordinates, releases his weapon, and turns for home, often without ever laying eyes on his target. Or the AWACS controller might assign the target to a different kind of killer. An Apache attack helicopter hovering motionless behind a sand dune, its rotors barely turning. The gunner in the front seat is not scanning the horizon with binoculars. He is staring at a green screen. Suddenly, a new target box, assigned from the AWACS hundreds of miles away, snaps into focus on his display. He has not seen the enemy. He has not heard the enemy. He has simply been told where the enemy is. He places his crosshairs over the green box and pulls the trigger. The Hellfire missile that leaps from its rail is the final link in this chain of distributed lethality. It is a fire-and-forget weapon. The Apache's laser briefly illuminates the target, giving the missile its final instructions, and then the helicopter can immediately break away, disappearing back behind the dune. The missile, now autonomous, flies a high arcing trajectory, striking the T-72 not on its thick frontal armor, but from above, on the thin, vulnerable armor of its turret roof. The result on the ground is another surgical, complete, and utterly inexplicable kill. General Moyes, a man who understands the brutal physics of iron and explosives, struggles at first to conceptualize this new kind of war, a war choreographed by invisible packets of data. The entire ethos of the Red Army had been built on tangible, physical principles: displacement, mass, force. He had never been trained to think about war in terms of milliseconds and data transfer rates. While the engineers in Moscow's research institutes were scouring their manuals for a single, secret device to blame, a new bomber that could make radars go white, a terrifying particle beam that burned from orbit, they were missing the quiet, banal, and infinitely more revolutionary instrument at the heart of it all. The real instrument, the invisible string that tied the entire American nervous system together, was quieter, almost humble in its design. It was a tiny, precise timing code, pulsed from a handful of atomic clocks housed in satellites in medium Earth orbit. It was the Global Positioning System, or GPS. In 1991, GPS was not yet the ubiquitous civilian utility it is today. It was a purely military system, and its effect on the battlefield was nothing short of revolutionary. It told every American tank, every soldier, and every aircraft exactly where it was on the face of the Earth at every second of the day, with an accuracy of a few feet. But crucially, because every friendly unit was part of the same network, it also let them know where all their friends were. For the first time in history, the fog of war could be lifted. 2 American armored columns could drive at full speed at night through a blinding sandstorm and never lose their formation or risk a friendly fire incident. They could be vectored to new objectives, retasked on the fly, and reassembled into new formations, all guided by the invisible strings of time and position pulsed from the sky. "GPS is not a weapon," said Colonel Petrov, the GRU officer in charge of signal collection. He was a man educated in the Soviet love of grand, visible gestures, massive missiles, intimidating parades, and thick, doctrinal manuals. He poured himself a small glass of vodka, the tremor in his hand almost imperceptible. "But," he added, his voice low with a grudging, newfound respect, "it makes every weapon better." The Soviet attempt to counter this new celestial advantage was almost comical in its immediacy and its ultimate futility. As soon as their signals intelligence confirmed the Americans were relying on satellite navigation, trucks carrying R-330P, Mandat, and other mobile jamming systems were rushed to the theater. These were powerful, brute force electronic warfare systems designed to throw up a massive wall of radio noise to drown out the faint GPS signals in a targeted area. The Soviet advisors were confident if they could darken the digital sky, the Americans would be blinded, forced to stumble through the desert like their Iraqi proxies. But the American military had thought of that. Their military-grade GPS receivers were not like the simple commercial units of today. They used the encrypted jam-resistant PY code. More importantly, they were tightly integrated with a much older, more robust technology, inertial navigation systems, or INS. An INS uses a complex set of gyroscopes and accelerometers to track a vehicle's own motion. It knows where it started and it calculates its new position based on how far and in what direction it has moved. Its weakness is that it drifts over time, becoming less accurate the longer it operates without an external fix. The GPS was not the system's only brain. It was a constant, perfect corrector for the INS. The Soviet jammers, burning immense amounts of energy, were like garden sprinklers trying to block out the sun. They could disrupt the GPS signal for brief periods in a limited area, but during those moments, the American vehicles simply coasted on their highly accurate inertial guidance. When they moved out of the jamming field, the GPS receiver would instantly reacquire its position and correct any drift. The Soviet jammers were a crude patch applied to a system that did not belong to them. They revealed their own position, burned precious fuel, and ultimately achieved nothing. As the 100-hour war concluded, the final reports laid out the brutal arithmetic of this systemic defeat. Of the nearly 500,000 men and thousands of tanks the Iraqi army had arrayed across Kuwait and Iraq, the losses amounted to a virtual annihilation of a modern military. Nearly 4,000 tanks were destroyed, captured, or rendered unserviceable. In contrast, the American 7th Corps, which had conducted the main armored thrust, lost a total of 36 M1 Abrams tanks. Of those, none were lost to Iraqi main gun fire. The vast majority of those losses were from mines or, tragically, from friendly fire, a problem that, despite the new technology, had not been entirely solved. The ratio of air combat kills read like an epitaph for a generation of Soviet pilot training. In direct fighter duels, 38 Iraqi aircraft, mostly Soviet-made MiGs, were shot down. The number of American losses in those same engagements was 0. These were not merely military statistics to be filed away in an archive. They were a mirror held up to 5 decades of Soviet state policy, industrial design, and military doctrine. The numbers proved with cold mathematical finality that it had all been a catastrophic failure. Inside the Moscow bunker, a frantic debate erupts. The generals, confronted with the reality of a systemic failure, revert to their old, comfortable way of thinking. They begin to argue over which part of the American machine they can steal. If the enemy's advantage is a network, then surely that network is comprised of individual components, of tangible pieces of hardware that can be captured, analyzed, and copied. The hunt for a single, technological silver bullet begins anew, this time focused on the most mysterious and terrifying asset in the American arsenal, the F-117 stealth fighter. The work of the Lockheed Skunk Works was already a legend in the halls of Soviet intelligence. They knew the F-117 existed, but its performance in the opening nights of the air war had been devastatingly perfect. It was a plane made of flat, angular panels and controlled by a revolutionary fly-by-wire computer system, a machine that had traded speed and agility for the ability to become nearly invisible to high-frequency fire control radars. It had struck the most heavily defended targets in Baghdad with impunity, and the Iraqi air defense network, a robust and modern system supplied by the Soviets themselves, had never seen a thing. The men of the PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, were particularly haunted by this invisible killer. Their entire careers had been built on the certainty that anything that flies can be detected. Now they were faced with a ghost. In their desperation, they latched onto a theoretical vulnerability. Their older, long-wave search radars like the P-12, Spoon Rest, and the P-18 Patty Cake operated at a much lower frequency. In theory, the physics of these long wavelengths meant that they might be able to detect the F-1-17, not as a precise target, but as a large, vague blot on the screen. It was a desperate, almost Rube Goldberg-like idea. The low-frequency radars were too imprecise to actually guide a missile. But, the PVO theorists argued, they could be used as an early warning tripwire. An operator who spotted a suspicious blot could then hand off the approximate location to a larger, more modern SA-10 missile battery. The SA-10 could then saturate that entire box of sky with a volley of missiles, hoping to get lucky. It was a strategy of firing a shotgun blast into a dark room where you think you heard a noise. The idea was slow, clumsy, and deeply inefficient, but its serious consideration showed how bounded their imagination had become by hardware solutions rather than software or systemic thinking. While the air defense generals chased radar phantoms, the story of the highway of death provided a more brutal and ultimately more important lesson. The destruction of that Iraqi column was not a morality play about a fleeing army. It was a perfect, chilling anatomy of the American system at work. It was the J-STARS operator circling safely at high altitude who first saw the column coalesce into a target. It was the AWACS officer who received that data, deconflicted the airspace, and began to route the killers. It was the F-15E pilot who, instead of searching for a target, simply received a set of coordinates on his screen and dropped a laser-guided bomb. It was the Apache gunner who hovered behind a hill, received a digital target passed from the JS-STARS, and pushed a single button, sending a Hellfire missile on its way. For over 10 hours, the Americans processed targets with the cold, relentless efficiency of a machine: detect, classify, assign, strike. The cycle repeated again and again. On the ground, the Iraqi column had no such privileges. They were not a fighting force. They were a long, vulnerable list on a luminous board in the sky. They were visible, they were helpless, and they were systematically dismantled piece by piece by an enemy they never saw. This was the true nature of the network, a system that converted perfect information into lethal action on demand at a tempo that was simply impossible for a traditional, hierarchical army to counter. The highway of death was not a battle, it was an industrial process. The image that haunts General Moyes in the quiet, sleepless nights that follow is not the grand strategic map of the highway of death. It is a single, grainy photograph of a destroyed Iraqi T-72. The tank has not been incinerated or blown to pieces. It sits almost peacefully in the desert sand, but its turret has been lifted cleanly off its hull and set down a few feet away like a lid that has been gently removed from a box. It is the image of a tank that has been effortlessly plucked. This single, quiet image becomes his private ghost, a symbol of a vulnerability so profound he can barely articulate it. The engineers, however, believe they have a solution. Their answer to this new, terrifying threat from above is Contact 5, a new generation of explosive reactive armor, or ERA. Unlike the light ERA bricks designed to defeat shaped charge warheads, Contact 5 is a series of heavy steel boxes filled with a powerful explosive designed specifically to defeat the long, thin darts of kinetic energy penetrators. The theory is that when a dart, like a Hellfire's precursor charge or a smaller submunition, hits the box will explode outward, shattering or deflecting the incoming threat before it can touch the tank's main armor. The program is given the highest national priority. The Kremlin orders that Contact 5 be bolted onto the front and top of every new T-80 and T-72 tank rolling off the production lines. It is a massive, expensive, and visually impressive undertaking. The sleek, low-slung profiles of the Soviet tanks are now covered in these angry-looking bricks, but it is a solution that treats the symptom, not the disease. It is an attempt to solve an information problem with a block of steel and explosives. In a quiet, bitter moment, one of the younger engineers in the design bureau describes it as bolting dignity onto a corpse. The new armor makes the tanks heavier, slower, and puts immense strain on their already overburdened engines and suspensions. It is a patch, a desperate physical response to a threat that is fundamentally non-physical. The disease is not the Hellfire missile. The disease is the fact that the Apache firing it knows exactly where to aim. The GRU dispatches teams to the Gulf to collect battlefield wreckage, sending back fragments of American ordnance, pieces of Hellfire missiles, guidance fins from paveway bombs, and the shattered electronic boards of Joint Direct Attack Munitions, or JDAMs. The fragments are sent to the top research institutes in Moscow for analysis. Findings are both banal and utterly scalding. Inside the weapons, the Soviet scientists do not find a revolutionary new explosive or a magical new metal. They find guidance kits, thermal seekers, and most importantly, microprocessors. They find millions of lines of elegant, efficient computer code. The heart of the American advantage is not an atom of copper in a warhead, but the tiny, intricate world of silicon chips. The research centers that had built the Soviet Union's lumbering mainframe computers in the 1970s had spent the 1980s desperately trying to copy Western chip designs, and they had failed. The microelectronics factories in Moscow, Kiev, and Minsk, starved of investment and stifled by a rigid, centrally planned system, could not hope to match the relentless, exponential pace of the West's CMOS revolution. This is the moment of true, chilling clarity for the analysts in Moscow. You can steal a plane, you can reverse engineer a missile, but you cannot steal an entire ecosystem of production. You cannot replicate overnight the vast, interconnected network of venture capital, university laboratories, and commercial chip fabrication plants that produce tiny, fast, cheap, and reliable processors by the millions. The American military had not built its own separate technological base. It had simply harnessed the massive creative power of its commercial sector. The Soviet Union, with its closed, secretive, and inefficient military-industrial complex, had no answer. The ghost that had haunted them was not made of steel or secret alloys. It was made of silicon and software. The realization that the core of the American advantage is not a single, stealable piece of hardware, but a vast and diffuse technological culture, sends a wave of despair through the Soviet high command. This is a problem that cannot be solved by espionage or reverse engineering. It is a systemic civilizational failure. The Soviet Union's inability to copy the American ecosystem of innovation reveals the deep, structural rot at the heart of their own system. For decades, the Soviet model had prized central planning, absolute secrecy, and, above all, mimicry. When the West developed a new technology, the Soviet design bureaus were tasked with creating a functional copy. But the American system that had produced the victory in the Gulf was different. It prized decentralization, open academic research, and the powerful incentives of private enterprise. One system built great monolithic projects directed from the top down. The other fostered a million small, fast, and often chaotic experiments from the bottom up. When those two logics met on the sands of the Persian Gulf, the latter, nimble, networked, and stitched together by silicon and open protocols, proved decisively superior. There is a unique cruelty to networks that the old, hierarchical Soviet mind struggled to comprehend. You can harden a single node, you can build a thicker wall around a single bunker, but if the network understands where everything is, it can simply route its attacks around your defenses and find your softest, most vulnerable spot. The Iraqi army had spent years building a formidable defensive line, a fortress of steel and concrete. The American network didn't bother to smash its way through that fortress. It simply flew over it, saw its command and control brain, and surgically removed it, causing the entire structure to collapse from within. The human stories that began to trickle out of the conflict, as American soldiers and airmen gave interviews, only deepened the cultural dissonance. A JSTARS operator named Carter would later write about the experience of watching the Iraqi convoy appear on his screen as a long, neat string of digital icons. He did not feel the visceral hatred of a soldier in a foxhole. He felt a strange, detached sense of control. "We were shepherds," he wrote, guiding the flock. An Apache crewman with the call sign Reaper described how he had hovered in a desert depression, his thermal sight switched to grayscale, until a green target box assigned from a distant AWACS simply popped up on his heads-up display with the precise coordinates of an Iraqi tank. He fired one hellfire, then another. He watched on his screen as the tank's turret separated cleanly from its hull, a perfect theatrical explosion. Reaper's voice was flat, almost bored, when he described the moment. It felt like clicking a mouse. For the generals in Moscow, men who had been raised on stories of heroic sacrifice at Stalingrad and the brutal physical struggle of the Great Patriotic War, this was an alien language. War was supposed to be about mud and blood and courage. It was not supposed to be about shepherds and clicking a mouse. The American way of war seemed sterile, post-human, a terrifying fusion of video games and lethal reality. The metaphors inside the Kremlin began to turn to theology. In their internal memos, frustrated and frightened men started calling GPS the god of war. They wrote of the American network with a kind of superstitious awe, not because it was magic, but because they could not comprehend the cultural and economic system that had produced it. It was not just blasphemy against their own hardware. It was a deep and painful cultural dissonance. They had built a world of titans, and they had been defeated by a swarm of intelligent insects. The attempt to close this gap was now a flurry of panicked protocols, a desperate rush to develop new jammers to steal code and to reverse engineer components. But the Soviet industrial pattern, tied to the slow, grinding gears of state ministries and massive, inefficient plants, was simply too slow. It could not keep up. In the months that followed the ceasefire, the Kremlin's institutions forced themselves through a grim and painful pedagogy. The NI4 Institute, the central body tasked with analyzing foreign military technology, finally produced its consolidated report that summer. Its conclusions were written in the dry, clinical language of engineers, but their effect was devastating. The Soviet Union, the report stated, had not lost because its steel was weak or its soldiers were cowards, but because its entire industrial and military model did not produce the small, fast, interoperable, and software-driven elements that are the foundation of modern networks. The report identified GPS, JSTARS, AWACS, and precision munition guidance not as independent technological miracles, but as modular components of a single, integrated system. The principal effect of this system, the analysts concluded, was to convert information into lethal action on demand with a speed that their own hierarchical command structure could not possibly match. The report's language was technical, the effect was civilizational. A doctrine that had imagined war as a predictable equilibrium of physical forces had failed to anticipate a system that could rewrite the ground truth in milliseconds. The old machine could be adapted, Contact 5 reactive armor could be bolted on, New VHF radars could be developed, more sophisticated radios could be installed, but these were adaptations, not transformations. You could add a bandage to a failing heart. You could not easily redesign the entire circulatory system that kept it alive. There were quieter, more profound political consequences that summer as well. The economy that had paid for the tens of thousands of Soviet tanks was unraveling. The state that had protected the factories now found itself short of both cash and ideas. The military autopsy of Desert Storm was a mirror held up to the failures of the Soviet economy itself. If the West's decisive advantage rested on a vast, diffuse, and chaotic ecosystem of innovation, venture capital, university labs, commercial chip fabs, then the Soviet central planning machine was not structured to replicate it. It could copy a finished design, but it could not copy the culture of continual, small-scale experimentation and rapid iteration that had produced it. When General Miquel Moise read the final NI4 report, he did not feel triumphant at having his early fears validated, nor did he feel outraged. He simply felt small. He had spent a life learning how to reduce war to a set of manageable variables, and here was an equation he had not even known how to write. He recognized, too late, that the war had not been lost in the desert sands of Iraq. It had been lost 2 decades earlier in the laboratories of California and in the minds of a generation of engineers who refused to prize grand, monolithic blueprints over the power of small, messy, interconnected bets. One evening, months after the ceasefire, he walked to a window in the Ministry of Defense and looked east over the sprawling city of Moscow. In the distance, the winter sky sliced clear and cold. The world had changed while they were still arguing about blame. Across the globe, in Silicon Valleys and in quiet university basements, engineers had already started writing the next chapter. The system that had harvested the Iraqi column was not a single product that could be stolen and copied. It was an operating principle that would, in time, bleed into commerce, politics, and culture. The age of networks had arrived, and it would erase boundaries and topple monoliths. He remembered the words of the Iraqi tank colonel who had watched his crews vanish into the darkness. "It was like fighting a ghost," the man had said. "1 second we were whole, the next we were just a number on someone else's screen." The god they had feared was not an angel with a beam of fire or a monstrous new bomber. It was a quiet pulse of time and position from medium Earth orbit, an everyday utilitarian signal that no one in their system had thought to worship. It was, in the end, a truth with 1,000 small, ordinary faces, a J-STARS radar sweep, an AWACS data handoff, the green target box on an Apache's HUD, the silent track of a Hellfire missile. Each component was ordinary. Together, they were omniscient and lethal. The Soviet Union would try to learn. It would develop its own reactive armor and fight to upgrade its radars. It would send its brightest mind to study microelectronics and software. But systems are cultural artifacts, and culture is slow and difficult to change. The autopsy of the highway of death was also an indictment, a society that prizes the top-down replication of power over the bottom-up generation of innovation will inevitably find itself outpaced in a world where speed and adaptability matter most. In the end, the story was not just military, it was epistemic, a lesson about what it means to know, to sense, and to act first. The Red Army had been a paradigm of industrial certainty, of mass and momentum. The American force that crossed the desert had been a demonstration of a new kind of certainty, that information, cohered and shared, could make brute iron irrelevant. Thank you for joining us on this journey into a pivotal, yet often overlooked moment in modern history. If this story resonated with you, we would be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.